Hello or namaste. Welcome to Atypical Dikkatein, a conversation podcast. I'm your host Soumya, and in this podcast, I will be talking to fellow queer, neurodivergent, and disabled folks. Why? Because I want to. This podcast will not just be a repository of stories and experiences, but it will also be a journey to build solidarity, queer intimacy, and a community. Hopefully, by embarking on this journey, I will be able to find a sense of belongingness and a space where queer and disabled folks like me can share our unique joys as well as challenges and feel less alone in a world where we face constant invisibilization. This is a way of taking up space according to our own terms. So today I have Srishti Pandey with me. Shrishti is a student of psychology based in Delhi. She deeply cares about disability rights and inclusion and believes in taking an intersectional approach to her work, which revolves around various aspects of disability and ableism. In the future, she aspires to become a disability affirmative psychologist. Hey Shrishti, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Soumya. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, super excited to have you here. So, in this episode, which is Rebellious Srishti Ki Gazab Kahani, we'll get a chance to have a look into Srishti's life, her story, and motivation, why she wants to ultimately become a disability affirmative psychologist. So, we'll start it from the top with Srishti's story. So, tell me, Srishti, how did your childhood look like? What got you invested in disability rights?
Um, I acquired my disability at the age of 3, and since then, obviously this means that my life was always kind of different from others. My parents had no awareness, no resources, nothing at all. I was the only member in our entire family who had a disability. So, like, my parents had a lot uh, to learn and unlearn, and they were trying their best, despite their, you know, uh, despite their determination of trying to give me a life I deserved. It was very difficult for them to be able to do that because of their ableism. Getting admissions in school, which is actually something very basic, and not everyone has to think about something as basic as this, right? But even that was very difficult for me and my family. My parents had to run here and there, trying to find schools which were ready to accept me. There was this one school which did accept me, but right after, like within a year, actually, they kicked me out simply because I was disabled. And I don't know. That's how I've been growing up, right? I was so young, but I was just 4, but I remember it so vividly how they called my parents, and they just said that we cannot teach kids like this. And since then, I started internalizing that, okay, I am a misfit and I do not belong here. This is why it's happening to me. This is why they don't uh, want me to be in a school uh, with others, right? Um, After, then eventually we got associated with certain organizations, etc. And we were finally able to find a school which agreed to let me in, and kind of, um, yeah. So it's the same school I've graduated from. But even though, like, the teachers were better here and they were kinder, the school infrastructure wise was inaccessible. So I had to be picked up by the non-teaching staff. To So they would pick me up and drop me to my classrooms. So for 14 years of my life, I was being picked up by random men. Um, and till this date, I do not know what a science lab looks like, a physics, chemistry, biology labs look. How do they look like? I have no idea, because they were always on different floors, and I couldn't move beyond that one particular desk that I was made to sit on every day. which also meant that I didn't have a choice in making friends because I had to be friends whoever was willing to come and sit near me and around me, right? So yeah, my childhood was actually very different. It was isolating, lonely. I didn't have a lot of opportunities, and I was just trying very hard to navigate my way through everything.
Yeah, and also this makes me realize of my privilege and the difference when it comes to different types of disabilities, right? It's never constant and the needs fluctuate. Everybody has different needs which has to be accommodated. I'm so sorry and heartbroken to hear this, and it makes sense why what got you invested in the disability rights movement. And you're absolutely right when it comes to infrastructure and schools. They are so inaccessible and in various ways. Physically, they're inaccessible. There's a lack of ramps and there's a lack of lifts, and there are like so many different sensitivities. Like for me, for example, it's very painful when the lights are too bright or there's a lot of noise. And school itself is a place which is so overstimulating for me. And I constantly tried to push myself, like I internalized it, right? I'm too sensitive. I see everything, I feel everything. I'm too sensitive. I need to train myself. And that feeling of being a misfit amongst people, I relate to that. So, could you tell me a bit more about the ableism that you faced in public spaces and even in school? I know because of the dependency that's there, because of the support that many disabled people need, we are more prone to abuse in various forms as well. And I think you touched a bit on that, but could you tell us more about the spectrum of abuse that disabled people face because of the ableism that exists in our society?
Right. Soumya, as you mentioned that every disability is different, and everyone have like they have their own needs and accommodations, and I don't think people realize that, and they don't realize the importance and the power of enabling spaces. Um, so, and also, you mentioned that there are no ramps or lifts. It's not just about having ramps or lifts. In fact, um, accessibility it goes beyond than just a ramp and a lift, right? Um, I also had o- in my school there was another wing, a separate wing. It was called a special wing for those with disabilities. So the fact that the school claimed itself to be inclusive because it had students with disabilities studying there, but at the same time, they had segregated them into another space, right? Because like they couldn't interact with others then, and just 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 the fact that they had a separate building for those who are disabled, it just says a lot, right? And uh, it is also a kind of a neglect, and it's also a form of abuse because you're marginalizing us even more. You're keeping us away from the mainstream society. I was very lucky that um, I was given a chance to, go to the general wing because initially I was also admitted in that particular wing, and it was only later when I was shifted to the general wing. And I was very privileged that I would like that it happened to me because I mean, I often think about uh, them, right? Those students who had to be there and who still probably like the system hasn't changed, and I don't know how they feel about it because for me it sucked. I never wanted to go to school, because I felt so different. I had no one I could relate to. Um, so that's one thing. And the fact that people don't realize what inaccessibility does to you, right? They think that, ठीक है, that if there's, for example, if there's no lift and there are just stairs, they'll lift you up. What's a big deal? But the fact that the buildings were so inaccessible, they gave these random men access to my body, right? And it was really uncomfortable, but I had no other choice. No other school wanted to accept me, so I had to be there. And I had I didn't have another option other than to be picked up by these men since such a young age. There were also there were days when I think assembly periods, like that is standard and happens in every school. So you know how in assemblies the entire school goes to the ground. I couldn't do that. I had to sit alone in the entire building. Imagine. And uh, there was this one time when I was almost molested because I was alone, and there were no teachers in the building. There was no student, and it just inaccessibility. It opens up ways for other kinds of abuse to happen. It just makes it so much more easier for abusers. And also the fact that I couldn't choose friends. I had no social life. Like I did have a few friends, and that was only because I used to push my boundaries so much. And now I have become this person who's not assertive, who gets exploited all the time. I have no sense of boundaries. I'm a huge people pleaser. And all of this happened because of my past experiences, right? So I always thought that I have to prove myself. I have to prove myself. And that's why I would offer extra help to my peers academically. I would uh, offer to help them with their homeworks, their assignments, projects, and all of that. I also didn't have a lot of opportunities. These are all forms of abuse which people don't realize, by the way, right? Because on one hand, everyone was getting so many opportunities to go participate in a lot of debates, for example, a lot of different kinds of competitions. I couldn't do that because the halls were inaccessible. I couldn't move beyond my classroom, right? Um, and not to mention the bullying that used to happen by teachers and students. So remember, I told you in the starting that a school kicked me out. Before they kicked me out, the class teacher then, and I was just, what, four, right? But I still remember it so clearly because it's just ingrained in my brain. The class teacher then, what she would do was, so that we used to have these little assignments, right? So, for example, a creative writing thingy where we had to write those letters in cursive language. I still remember that day so clearly. So she would give me a certain grade, and when she would see that it's me who she's graded, she would cut the grade in front of me and give me a lower grade. So you know, uh, that's just, why would you do that to a child who is just four? Um, so these things used to happen, and abuse was coming from everywhere, not just my peers, but my teachers, the non-teaching staff, right, and strangers, in fact. So yeah, it was like that, and during my boards, so my final exams in 12th grade, uh, there was this invigilator who called my mom specially after the exam ended, and he suggested that she should buy me, she should get me this government phone booth, uh, because apparently the government that time was offering disabled people, and he suggested that to her because he thought that that is where I belonged, and it would be convenient, quote unquote convenient, and quote unquote easier for my family to buy me a booth so that I don't have to do anything and just sit over there rather than investing in my education. And that is such a messed up thought, right? This is coming from a teacher, imagine. So yeah, that happened. And talking about public spaces. So in my entire school life, I never I only remember going out with my friends like twice. That too also in like very later stages, so like in grade 12, right? I because I was never invited to parties or hangouts, etc. Um, and then after school ended, I was very glad when I got into my dream college, and I was like, yay, independence. Now, I will learn to travel myself. And it was a very nice experience in that sense. I had never traveled in metros before, but it was very easy for me to be able to do that because metros are very accessible in Delhi. Um, right? So I was just starting to, enjoy this kind of new, some sort of independence that I had found. That it was then when I realized that even public spaces are so scary. And so, the moment I step out of my house, everyone stares at me. The staring I'm still kind of used to now, but random people, they keep coming to me and they keep asking me such intrusive questions, and I don't know how to answer them. And it's just so annoying and awkward because these are random people who I've never met in my entire life, and they're just coming to me and asking me what happened to you, or they just come and say, "Oh, may God bless you." Oh, she's such a poor girl. I don't want to hear that in the morning, right? But that happens all the time. Apart from that, public spaces are not at all accessible, which means that, for others, when anyone has to hang out, they just have to kind of pick a place, call their friends, and just go over there. But for me, I have to take an entire day out just to research about places which are accessible so I can go out and hang there with my friends, right? So, one, there are there are no accessible or very little accessible places, very few accessible places, and even with them, sometimes I'm denied entries just because I'm on a wheelchair. Last year, I was denied entry to this very popular cafe, a very popular eatery, and the reason was that that my wheelchair would disturb other customers. I don't know what they mean by that, but yeah, these things keep happening to me. And also the fact that since everywhere it is inaccessible, whenever I'm out, I cannot eat or drink. I have to. So now my body is adapted to just survive on less than half a liter water a day, right? So I don't drink a lot of water because then I would have to use the washrooms, and washrooms are not accessible. I cannot eat however much I really want to whenever I'm out. And when you're out with your friends, food and drinks, they kind of like they kind of create a vibe, right? They kind of help you connect with each other, but I'm not able to participate in that sense. So yeah, I think that's all about how public spaces are for me and how academic spaces have been for me.
I mean, I am in like various varying capacities. I can relate so much, Srishti, because what you said, initially about school, how there was segregation, that itself is a sort of otherization, right? Inclusivity doesn't mean like getting people from different backgrounds into one space. You need to create that space, transform that space, script that space and time in order to include diverse bodies, but people don't understand that, and this keeps happening again and again. And like you said, so true. It's like the spectrum of abuse is it's a spectrum, right? There's physical, sexual, emotional. The when your agency is taken away, when your consent is taken away, and you have to constantly push yourself, it hampers your emotional well-being. your mental health. And like you, I am a chronic people pleaser. I will bend over backwards to make people happy, and this is something that I'm trying to work on, to assert my boundaries and take care of my mental health. But yeah, this happens because you want to be accepted, you want to be validated, but unfortunately, you don't fit in. And ultimately, you end up, internally fractured. You don't have a sense of self. I relate to it so much, actually. And recently, like, I've started speaking up about, like, if there's too much noise, if we can move to a different area, where the light doesn't directly fall on my eyes, all that stuff. I'm slowly learning to ask for these accommodations, insist on these accommodations, and yeah, I completely hear you. And building on that, like, how our agency is taken away when you are disabled, different kinds of disabilities, and you're sort of also desexualized, right? Like, for me, one of the things that I hear all the time is I'm childlike. So you sort of like face that infantilization, and um, I know, like, when people picture a disabled person, they immediately desexualize them. And in order to consider someone a person with an agency, you need to look at them as a person first and not dehumanize them, right? And that's also something that I kind of have like a bit of problem with, like, how immediately when you think about disability, people think that, okay, they are just asexual, but people have no understanding about asexuality. And I know you identify as an asexual individual, so I'd love to know your thoughts. How did you realize? What was your journey like? And yeah, what do you think about how this desexualization affects disabled folks?
So I completely relate with you, Somna, when you how you talked about infantilization. That's something that I've also faced all my life. My decisions are not taken seriously, or they're made for me by others, right? Because apparently they think that disabled people are not smart enough to make decisions for themselves. And when it comes to, especially taking agency on things like our identities and our sexual identities, our gender identities, I think then it gets really worse and really complicated, because there are so many notions that people have out there. And I completely agree with you on, the people do not understand asexuality. So usually they think that disabled people, they're non-sexual actually, because asexuality is also a sexual orientation, right? So they think that disabled people have no sense of sexuality in that sense, and they usually end up terming their this prejudice, and they eventually, they end up calling disabled people as asexual. So for the longest time, and you know how the disabled community has been fighting over agency, and they've been, trying to kind of establish that no, disabled people can have sex, for example. They do have their own sexual identities, sexual orientations, and you cannot take that away from us. So, I had just started, like, I had just entered these conversations, right? I was very young, and I kind of always knew that something is different for me, and that I'm not as sexual as others, but I didn't know anything about asexuality because no one ever taught me that. And in the disability movement, everyone was, constantly trying to establish that we're not asexuals, and, people with disabilities can have sex, and disabled people, this and that, which is completely valid. I totally agree with them, right? But the fact that they, everyone around me kept saying that disabled people are not asexual, they're not asexual, they're not asexual. There was no asexual disabled person in my life, right? So there was no representation. So I thought that being asexual was actually, so I thought I was doing some sort of crime, and I was kind of doing something wrong, something my disabled community would disapprove of, because I hadn't, like, I never heard, I never had such an experience with anyone else, like, right? So one, I was very confused about asexuality, and second, I didn't know if that was allowed in the disabled community. But then, eventually, it actually happened like just 2 years back, when I was really able to understand what asexuality is, and I understood that okay, it's a spectrum. So I can, like, it's okay if I want to, for instance, kiss someone or hug them or cuddle with them. I can do all of that, but still identify as someone who is asexual. I didn't know earlier that it's a spectrum, but once I understood it, I was like, oh, that I was so relieved, and I felt so liberated that okay, this is me. Yeah, this is how I want to identify myself, and I was very happy. And it was kind of difficult to come out as a disabled person who's also asexual, because I didn't know how people would take it. um you know so but I did it anyway. I just knew that I had to. So I came out publicly, and I talked about how just whatever I've said right now. So I talked about how there are no conversations around disability and asexuality, and no reinforcements around that. So I talked all about that, and then eventually I actually met with a few, through that post that I made on my social media accounts. I actually ended up meeting a few disabled asexual people, and I was so happy. I was like, oh my god, I'm not alone. Right? So this is how it uh, went. Like even right now, I do not know a lot of disabled people who also identify as asexual, but yeah, no, at least I know some people, and I'm very happy about that.
Actually, I relate to that so much because for the longest time, I thought that I was broken. I identify as a biromantic asexual. So, yeah, I think I started getting access to the language in 2018-19, and like it brought me a sense of validation. I remember I met another asexual person at university, and that was like a game changer for me. I was able to accept myself, and otherwise, for the longest time, because of what is discussed in popular culture, I thought because it's because of my trauma, or because of my mental health, and all that stuff. But I have urges too, like you said, asexuality is a spectrum. I want to kiss, but I don't want to go further, which is also completely valid, and that needs to be accepted and affirmed, because otherwise, under compulsory heterosexuality, the agency of asexual people is taken away, and people think it's just a phase, or you will just get over it if you meet the right person. And for me, another aspect comes here is that I'm neurodivergent, right? So I am either hyposensitive or hypersensitive. So I don't like all sorts of touches. And for me, the intersection of queerness and neurodivergence, they are deeply neuroqueer. For me, both of them inform each other, and I can't separate them. So yeah, there needs to be more discussion on these topics, because sometimes I feel because of the strict boxes that we have created, even within the movement, when it comes to the queer movement, like you hardly fit into those strict boxes. I think everyone should be able to identify themselves the way they want to, how they understand themselves, without facing gatekeeping, or without having to censor themselves. So yeah, that's very important, and we need to have more discussions on these intersections. And I think we talked a bit about like how our agency is taken away in visible and invisible ways, especially when the disability is non-visible. What are your thoughts on that?
That's very true. A lot of times people forget that there's something called intersectionality, and that one person's identities, they intersect with each other, and that kind of informs others how they are going to react to us or with us. And when, especially when it comes to invisible disabilities, so I also have a lot of neurodivergent traits. I haven't been clinically diagnosed yet because one, it is unaffordable. But yeah, so I think especially those who have invisible disabilities, they're just not believed, right? Because if it can't be seen, it's not there. And it that in those situations it gets so easy for people to just call you crazy and just get away with it, right? That, oh, you're just being crazy, you can't be feeling this, or you can't be doing this. It's just a crazy idea or a crazy decision that your brain is making you do. Or yeah, so I and this is something that I realized the moment I stepped into the activism space. So a lot of disability discourse and a lot of activism, quote unquote activism that happens, it kind of, there's always a hierarchy. So even within the disability community, I've observed that there's a hierarchy, right? Where those with invisible disabilities always come at the bottom. And a lot of times, even sometimes those who have visible disabilities, even they don't understand, they're not able to understand others. And you know so I think okay, I'm sorry, I think I've diverted a lot and now I'm complicated things. But my point here is that I totally relate to what you're saying, and from my personal experience and my friends experiences, I've seen that we're always invalidated, and it becomes worse for those with invisible disabilities, chronic pain, chronic illnesses. And there has to be more and more conversations around it, even within the disabled community. Because I think it's just really important to now highlight invisible disabilities also in the disability discourse, because they're also a part of the community, which is kind of, I think, neglected a lot of times. I don't know if I made any sense.
You made sense. You made sense. Absolute sense. And you know, talking about like the invisible aspect, it's not so much invisible also, because for me, for example, hyperfixations exist, hyperfocus exists. I forget to eat and drink sometimes, like a lot of times actually. So, and you start zoning out. You have the exhaustion that you feel, the effects of inhabiting inaccessible spaces. It manifests in physical forms. So when people say that invisible, it's non-visible to the person who is looking at you. And the terminology also comes from how the other person experiences our disability, right? So it's invisible to them, like I'm not causing any trouble to them, I'm not causing any problem to them, which is why it's invisible. But for me, it's creating a lot of challenges, and ultimately affecting my mental health. So it's non-visible to the person who's in front of me, but for me, the manifestations of living in a world which is not built for my needs, the repercussions are like very real. So yeah, and the thing that you mentioned about, like, you digressed a lot. This also brought something to my mind, because I tend to go on tangents, like in my head. Like whenever I'm having conversations, if I don't make points, if I don't make a structure, I start to go on different tangents. They make perfect sense in my head, like they are all well connected. Uh, but the person in front of me often feels like, okay, why is she talking about so many things at the same time? It doesn't make sense. And yeah, so that's why, like, when I have to go for meetings or calls, I have to structure it. So it's comfortable for the other person. So the point of saying this is that we are always trying to make others comfortable at the cost of our well-being, which shouldn't be the case. So yeah, just a thought. um, yeah, and now moving on to your motivation, like you mentioned that ultimately you want to be a disability affirmative psychologist, and totally makes sense. We need people who understand queerness, people who understand neurodivergence, um, and the spectrum of disabilities, because we keep hearing these stories, like even the mental health professionals are not well equipped. They are still the services are still very much rooted in the medical model of disability, right? Biomedical model. And people situate the problem within the individual, like the mental health professionals or the healthcare professionals. They situate the problem within the individual without looking at the economy, the social aspect. And we need to tackle those things around us in order to help the person, support the person, especially if you want to make it sustainable. Because you can only do so much, by just treating someone with medicines or whatever. And to be honest, that also sometimes to me feels sort of like misuse. I don't want to use the word abuse, but like a misuse. Like I was given a lot of medications without like proper counseling and proper tests. So that is also another type of abuse that many people go through, especially if the challenges, the disabilities are invisible, non-visible. So Trishti, what do you want to do? Like we know the motivation, but what do you want to achieve by being a disability affirmative psychologist? What do you envision? How should the landscape look like when it comes to providing support and care for people who are queer and are disabled?
So you know how, Soumya, whatever all the reasons that you've just mentioned, um, is because of why I wanted to be a therapist, be a disability affirmative therapist. So, when I started studying psychology, I realized how even psychology is so exclusive, and how that particular field, the field of mental health, is so inaccessible, and invalidating for an entire community. And that sucks, and that doesn't make any sense. I mean, it didn't make any sense to me, and I was like, wait, what's happening? And in psychology, we uh, differentiate those with mental illnesses, for example, and we call them abnormal. The fact that we're differentiating uh, people on the basis of normality and abnormality, that in itself, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. And then throughout my classes, in my bachelor's and in my master's, I realized how even the teachers who are supposed to have a lot of, I don't know, a lot of training, let's say, in the field, how they were also a lot of times invalidating, um, especially in my masters, uh, the professors there, they were so invalidating, and they would often use uh, derogatory terms in class for those who are disabled, uh, unintentionally, but yeah. So uh, I was like, okay, you know, we really need to connect the field of psychology with uh, disability theories, and we gotta do something about it. Um, and I was so sure then that, yeah, this is what I want to do. And also, coming from my lived experiences, so I tried to find, I was trying to find a therapist who understood disability, at least some aspects of disability, and I was shocked um, to see that there were no therapists that were available who knew about disabilities. Like I was able to find a therapist just last year towards the end, uh, and it was shocking to me because I thought that especially I don't know. I just think that psychologists should have certain knowledge about disabilities, um, but they don't. And as you said, they perceive disabled people mostly from the lens of medical models. Uh, so I wanted to change that, and I want to now practice as a therapy who sees practice as a therapist who sees disabled people as they are, and who creates a safe space for them and enabling space for them. And I don't want to invalidate my own community. I want, and I think the fact that there are no disabled psychologists, that in itself is pretty I don't know, like I would if there were disabled therapists, I would want to go to them because I would feel that they'd understand me more. So I want to create a sense of understanding in that sense and connect more with them. And apart from that, when I say disability affirmative, I don't only mean that in theoretical sense, but once I start with my practice, I would also try to make it inclusive in other ways as well. So, for example, uh, people often forget that having a disability is very expensive because there's so much of inaccessibility, and plus there's uh, additional expenses, medical expenses, which makes it very difficult for us financially then. And uh, therapy in general is very expensive. So I would, you know, want to offer services which are very affordable or on a sliding scale for those who have disabilities. Um, I would also make my, whatever space that I'm gonna own accessible in terms of infrastructure, and also just try to be as inclusive as I can. The other day, there was this message circulating in my groups that a deaf person wanted to go to therapy, but I don't think anyone has ever thought of uh, deaf people going to therapy, right? So now I was surprised that how is that person gonna find a therapist who knows sign language? Because I don't think um, people in general know sign language, right? So these are things that I want to kind of work on, and yeah, just at least I think that therapy as a space, that 1 hour should be inclusive, and that 1 hour should be a space where the community is validated enough and affirmed enough. So yeah.
That's so true, just makes you wonder, like you don't even have to think about certain things. Um, Even if you're disabled, because like we said, discussed, disabilities, they exist on a spectrum. We don't even think about things like, being, having a screen reader, we don't have to think about those things, or closed captioning. Um, like some of us do, like for example, I need to have captions if I'm watching something because I tend to zone out. But yeah, you get the idea, right? Like the things are basic, things, they are so inaccessible to various kinds of disabled people. So yeah, and the idea of like normal and abnormal, like everything comes from the DSM, like this binary of normal and abnormal exists, be it like mental illness, be it mental health, disability, neurodivergence, gender, sexuality. Like, we know that, homosexuality was considered an illness, and even asexuality was considered one. Only recently, like in the recent updated manual, it's written that if someone self identifies as an asexual, then they can't be diagnosed with certain disorders like sexual dysfunction disorders. But what about someone who doesn't have access to that language, right? They are still, prone to being like diagnosed with those disorders. So it's a long way to go, and I hope, sincerely, that you are able to create that space, because it's much needed. And it's a great segue also, because I want to know more about, like, how do you envision the space to be. Like, safety is such a subjective term, like, I might feel safe somewhere, and another queer disabled person might not feel safe there, and vice versa, right? So it's such a subjective thing. So how do you envision creating that safe and inclusive space? What can we do in our individual capacities to make someone feel safe?
I think a very simple answer to that should be to not assume someone's needs and accommodations. Because, as you know, we've been um kind of highlighting the fact that there are different kinds of disabilities, there are spectrums, and everyone has different need, and we cannot generalize disabilities. So it's really important to, always ask your disabled friend or disabled family member or your disabled client about their needs and accommodations. I think that is the best way to kind of, make them feel included. Um, so yeah, I think that number one should be there, and then also uh, respecting these accommodations, um, and not seeing them as privileges and seeing them as bare minimum instead. Um, I think that is something that people should do more often. They should ask more often uh, what they can do to create a safe space, because, as you said, it's subjective. I might need something and you may need something else. So it's better that, people ask both of us uh, what we may need. So yeah, I think ask asking instead of assuming should be a great start uh, uh, towards being inclusive, and also then respecting what we say, and validating it and believing us and our needs.
Yeah, I mean, so many people, like, now the like diversity, equity, and inclusion has become a buzzword now, and everybody wants to be inclusive without understanding what's inclusivity. And then when you start talking about accommodations, like, people don't really take it seriously. So yeah, that's there. And the other thing that you said, like, about assumptions, like, um for me it's a great, huge trigger. Like, when I use my words to convey whatever I want to convey. There's no underlying hidden emotion or subtext to it. And when people assume intentions or attach negative feelings to those words, when that's not where I'm coming from, it's a huge trigger for me, and just reminds me of all the miscommunications I have had in the past because of this. And yeah, it's so easy to ask, and I have very few people who have given me that space where I can ask them, and I know they trust me enough, where they can ask me stuff without directly attaching labels, such as like I'm being rude or angry. um, because again, communication between neurotypicals and neurodivergent folks, it's very different. Neither of them is wrong, but, like, neurotypicals have a lot of, like, subtext, social cues, unsaid, rules, which don't make sense to me. So if only people, like, created that space to ask instead of assuming. So yeah, here's to hoping that it happens. And I had a last question, like, what questions would you urge people or allies to ask to themselves and others about queerness and disability to destigmatize them?
I think there uh, has to be a lot of questions that people need to ask themselves. But I think one very important thing that those without disabilities and those who are neurotypical should really reflect upon is whose responsibility is it to uh, educate about disabilities and create awareness about disabilities. So, a lot of times people assume that it should only be the responsibility of those who are disabled to talk about it, to fight for it, to create awareness around it, educate others about it. But why does it always have to be our responsibilities? Why can't those without disabilities also do that? Why can't they also, take up the initiative to read upon disability issues and fight with us, for us? Of course, that doesn't mean that they end up taking our spaces, but kind of amplify our voices and support us and stand in solidarity with us. Um, so, for example, like this is something very small but and simple, but also important. So, whenever I make a new friend and we decide to meet up, I am usually the one who comes up with a list of accessible places that okay, this place is accessible. So I have to do the research every time. But it would be so nice, if for once someone else would do that for me and come to me and say, okay, hey Srishti, I found these places that are accessible, so we could go uh try and we could go we can just meet there. But that rarely happens. I have to be the one who is always suggesting people, always researching. So little things like that, because it isn't just my responsibility. We live in a society, and I think it should be something that people should be doing together. So that's something. And another thing that I think they should be asking themselves or thinking upon is that it is also related, it is similar to my earlier answer, and it's around validating those with disabilities. So, a lot of times for others, it is difficult to understand our experiences, which makes them to not believe us. And or how people come up with euphemisms, for example. So when I say that I identify as a disabled person, someone else would come and say that no, no, you should identify yourself as a specially abled person. But I don't want to do that. That is it. I am entitled to my disability, and at the same time, a disabled person may want to identify with the term, say, differently abled, which I think sh- should be their call, honestly. It is our disabilities and we are entitled to it. But a lot of times others think that they are the ones who can kind of suggest on uh, how we live our lives or how we identify ourselves, and end up invalidating us and disregarding our identities. um so I think they should also be kind of focusing on that, that um it is that we have different lives, and they cannot go on validating invalidating others like that. uh, and I think they should also be constantly questioning themselves and on how they can be better allies, right? Which would involve a lot of discussions, a lot of reading, a lot of watching. But yeah, I think once they start doing that, it may change a lot of things. for the disabled community. So yeah, I hope I made sense.
Yeah, I mean, you do make sense. It's just that people don't want to, because ultimately the emotional labor of educating others always falls on the marginalized person, which shouldn't be the case. But yeah, and like you said, no, you have to look up accessible places. For me, I have to, script my social interactions. Even if it's like, traveling somewhere, I need to like mentally prepare everything. I have to picture myself again and again, um, relieve those things, how am I going to navigate the airport? What will I do if there are so many people? Because it's very, it's stimulating, it's overstimulating. So the burden always falls on the marginalized, which sucks, and I wish that wasn't the case. But yeah, it's like you just have to keep pushing. And honestly, a part of me has also like realized that it's like sort of a thankless job, because I know not a lot of change is going to come in my lifetime at least. But there's no other way around. Like, you just have to keep pushing, and hopefully you will find some people, some like-minded people who will understand you, some allies who will make the effort to understand you and make your journey a little more um, bearable, if not, great. So yeah, here's to hoping that and keeping up with the work that we do to keep pushing. So yeah, but it seems like a long way to go when it comes to like inclusion, especially for disabled and queer folks. And it's even more difficult when you are living with multiple marginalizations, right? Like just a cis disabled person and a queer disabled person, the experiences are so different. There are so many more layers. So yeah, any parting thoughts, Srishti?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Especially when it comes to these intersections of queerness, of caste, class. I think people often miss them. Um, but yeah, let's just hope that we keep creating safe spaces and that we end up finding better allies, people who want to take the initiative, people who are who want to create enabling spaces.
Yeah, yes to that. Yes, yes to hoping that happens someday for us. Anyway, thank you so much, Srishti. It was great just talking to you. I for one feel less alone, and I hope through this conversation it was somewhat validating for you as well. Thank you for taking out the time and talking to me. Thank you to the listeners who are listening. If you are hearing this message, you have listened to the entire episode. And for that, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. You can listen to Atypical Dikkatein on Spotify. And if you want to reach out to me, your host, Soumya, check out the Linktree link in the description. See ya.